Jack Morrison hadn't left his house in 3 days when he spent his last $2 on a scarred wild foal that the crowd had already written off as dead. 8 months later, that same horse would pull him back from the edge of destruction and prove that sometimes the most broken souls are the only ones who know how to heal each other. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty auction yard in rural Montana, where the air smelled of hay, manure, and broken dreams. Jack Morrison stood at the edge of the crowded fence, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. At 52 years old, he looked much older, his face carved with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and memories he couldn't shake. The limp in his left leg was barely noticeable anymore, just another part of who he had become since coming home from Afghanistan 3 years ago. But the real wounds, the ones nobody could see, those were the ones that made every day feel like walking through quicksand. Jack had driven 2 hours to get to this livestock auction, though he couldn't quite remember why he'd come. His therapist at the VA hospital kept telling him he needed a purpose, something to focus on besides the nightmares that jerked him awake at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat and reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She'd suggested volunteering, maybe getting a pet, finding some way to connect with the world again. Jack had nodded politely during those sessions, but inside he felt like a man watching his own life through foggy glass, present but not really there. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers, rapid-fire numbers that meant nothing to Jack as various livestock paraded through the ring. Cattle, sheep, a few goats, all of them destined for new homes or new purposes. He'd almost turned to leave when the energy in the crowd shifted. People who'd been chatting fell silent, and a murmur of discomfort rippled through the gathered ranchers and farmers. That's when Jack saw it. They led the foal into the ring with 2 handlers, both struggling to control the small animal despite its size. It was a dark bay color, almost black in the shadowed areas of the arena, with a coat that should have gleamed, but instead looked dull and rough. But it wasn't the color that caught everyone's attention. It was the scars. Long, jagged marks crisscrossed the foal's flanks and shoulders, some old and silvered, others still pink and angry-looking. The young horse's eyes were wild, rolling white with terror, and it fought against the lead rope with every ounce of strength in its small body. "Now, folks, we've got ourselves a special case here," the auctioneer announced, his usual enthusiasm notably dampened. "This here's a Mustang foal approximately 8 months old, found wild up in the high country, got herself tangled in old barbed wire fencing. She's been treated by a vet, shots are up to date, but as you can see, she's got some scarring." The auctioneer paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's also what you might call spirited. Hasn't taken to handling well. Might be good for someone with experience in wild horse rehabilitation or, well, there are other options." The crowd understood the unspoken message. This foal was headed for slaughter if nobody wanted to take on the challenge of gentling her. Jack watched as the handlers struggled, saw the terror in the young horse's eyes, the way she trembled even as she fought. Something in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years, began to crack. "All right, let's start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer called out. The crowd remained silent. $40, still nothing. People shuffled their feet, looked away, checked their phones. This was the uncomfortable part of auction day, when economics collided with conscience, and economics usually won. 30? 20? The auctioneer's voice grew strained. "Come on, folks. We've got to move things along here." Jack's hand went up before his brain could stop it. $2, he heard himself say, his voice rough from disuse. The crowd turned to look at him, some faces showing pity, others relief that someone else was taking on the problem. The auctioneer looked almost apologetic as he said, "We've got $2, do I hear three? Going once, going twice." The gavel came down with a crack that made the foal jump. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $2. As Jack made his way to the office to settle up, he felt the stares following him. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, processed his paperwork with gentle efficiency. "You'll need a trailer," she said softly. "And I should warn you, that little one hasn't been loaded yet. It might take some doing." Jack nodded, suddenly aware of what he'd committed to. He didn't have a trailer. He didn't have a barn. His small property outside of town had a shed and about 5 acres of fenced pasture that he'd never done anything with, but that was it. He lived on his military disability and odd jobs, barely making ends meet most months. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself as he borrowed a neighbor's horse trailer, sweet-talking old Bill Henderson into letting him use it for the day with a promise to return it by evening. Bill had taken one look at Jack's face and handed over the keys without asking questions. That was the thing about small towns. People knew when to ask and when to just help. Loading the foal took 4 men and nearly an hour. She fought every step, her small hooves striking out, her body twisting and bucking against the ropes. By the time they finally got her in, everyone was sweating and Jack's bad leg was screaming in pain. As he climbed into his truck and started the engine, he caught sight of the foal through the trailer slats. She stood rigid, every muscle tensed, her sides heaving with panicked breaths. In that moment, looking at that terrified, scarred creature, Jack saw himself. He saw every veteran who'd come home broken, every soul that fought against kindness because trust had been shattered, every being that had learned the world was a dangerous place where survival meant never letting your guard down. "Maybe we can figure this out together," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't hear him over the engine. "Maybe we're both worth saving. We're both worth." The drive home felt longer than it should have, every bump in the road sending sounds of distress from the trailer behind him. Jack kept checking his mirrors, watching the trailer sway slightly with the foal's movements inside. He'd taken the back roads, avoiding the highway, not wanting to stress the young horse any more than necessary. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles white, and he realized with some surprise that for the first time in months he wasn't thinking about the things that usually haunted him. Instead, his mind raced with practical concerns he had no idea how to address. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. His property wasn't much, just a small ranch house that had seen better days, the paint peeling in places, the porch sagging slightly on one side. But the land around it was open and honest, 5 acres of Montana grassland bordered by weathered fencing that Jack had been meaning to repair for 2 years. The old shed behind the house had been used for storage when the previous owners kept horses, and though it was dusty and filled with cobwebs, it still had the bones of a decent shelter. Jack sat in the truck for a moment after cutting the engine, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silent. The foal had stopped moving around, but he could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow. He thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He had no experience with horses, let alone wild ones. He could barely take care of himself most days. His savings account was nearly empty, and horse feed wasn't cheap. The list of reasons to turn around and take her back grew longer with each passing second. But then he remembered the look in her eyes at the auction, that mixture of terror and defiance that he recognized so intimately. He remembered how the crowd had looked away, how easily they'd been willing to let her disappear into whatever fate awaited unwanted livestock. And he remembered the clerk's words, gentle but resigned, as if she'd seen this story play out 100 times before. Jack had spent 3 years feeling like an unwanted burden, like someone the world had looked away from. He wasn't going to do that to another living being. Getting out of the truck took more effort than it should have. His leg had stiffened during the drive, and the old injury sent sharp pains up his thigh as he put weight on it. He limped to the trailer, moving slowly, deliberately, trying not to make any sudden movements. Through the slats, he could see the foal pressed against the far corner, her body trembling, her eyes showing white all around. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're scared. I'm pretty scared too, if I'm being honest. Opening the trailer was going to be the tricky part." Jack had backed up to the shed's entrance, hoping he could create a path straight from the trailer into the shelter, but he knew the foal would probably bolt the moment she had the chance. He'd spent the last hour of the drive thinking about this moment, running through scenarios in his head, most of them ending with him lying in the dirt and the foal halfway to the next county. But there was nothing else to do except try. He opened the shed door first, checking to make sure there was nothing inside that could hurt the foal or give her a place to get stuck. The space was about 12 by 20 feet, with solid walls on 3 sides, and the open front where the door was. Old straw covered the floor, dusty but still serviceable. He'd need to get fresh bedding, grain, hay, so many things he didn't have and couldn't really afford. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he just needed to get the foal safely out of the trailer. Jack positioned himself at an angle where he could open the trailer door and then move aside quickly. His heart was pounding, that old familiar feeling from before a mission, when everything could go right or catastrophically wrong in a split second. He took a deep breath, said a prayer to whoever might be listening, and released the latch. The door swung open, and for a moment, nothing happened. The foal stood frozen in the trailer, her eyes locked on the opening, every muscle in her small body coiled tight. Then she exploded forward. It was like watching a small tornado. The foal burst from the trailer in a wild rush, her hooves barely touching the ground as she rocketed past Jack. He'd positioned himself well because she headed straight for the open shed door, instinct driving her toward the enclosed space that offered at least the illusion of protection. She skidded inside, spun around twice, and then pressed herself into the farthest corner, her sides heaving, nostrils flared wide. Jack moved carefully to close the shed door, leaving the top half open so light and air could come in, but the bottom secured so she couldn't escape. When he peered over the half door, the foal was watching him with those wild eyes, her whole body shaking. She looked even smaller in the shed, even more vulnerable, and Jack felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him that he hadn't experienced since his last deployment. "You're safe now," he told her, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. I promise you that." The foal didn't respond, just kept staring at him with that mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been the tiniest spark of curiosity buried deep beneath the terror. Jack stood at the shed door for a long time after securing it, just watching the foal as dusk settled over the property. The temperature was dropping, as it always did in Montana once the sun disappeared, and he could see his breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. The foal had stopped trembling quite so violently, but she remained pressed against the far corner, her dark eyes never leaving him. He knew he should go inside, make some calls, figure out what to do next, but something kept him rooted to that spot, as if leaving would somehow break whatever fragile thread had begun to form between them. Finally, as full darkness approached and the first stars began to appear overhead, Jack forced himself to move. His leg was throbbing now, a deep ache that he knew would keep him up most of the night, but that was nothing new. Pain was an old companion, reliable in its consistency. He limped back to the house, his mind already cataloging everything he'd need to do. First thing in the morning, he'd have to make a run to the feed store. The foal would need hay, grain, fresh water. He'd have to call Doc Henderson, the local veterinarian, get some advice on caring for a traumatized wild horse. The list felt overwhelming, but for once that feeling wasn't paralyzing. Inside the house, Jack's phone had 3 missed calls from his sister Sarah. She lived 2 hours away in Billings and called at least twice a week to check on him, ever since the divorce had finalized and Diane had moved to Seattle with someone who didn't wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He knew he should call her back, but he wasn't ready to explain what he'd done. Sarah was practical, sensible, the kind of person who balanced her checkbook to the penny and planned everything 3 months in advance. She'd think he'd lost his mind, and maybe he had, but he wasn't ready to defend his decision yet. Instead, he pulled out his laptop, the old thing taking forever to boot up, and started researching. Wild Mustang rehabilitation, traumatized horses, building trust with fearful animals. The information was overwhelming and often contradictory, but certain themes kept appearing. Patience, consistency, quiet presence. These weren't things that could be rushed or forced. Jack found himself reading about natural horsemanship, about trainers who spent months just being near horses, not trying to touch them or control them, just existing in their space until the animals learned that presence didn't equal danger. Hours passed without him noticing. When he finally looked up, it was past midnight, and his neck was stiff from hunching over the computer. But he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that took him a moment to identify. It was purpose. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, he had something that needed him, something that depended on him, something that gave his days structure and meaning beyond just surviving until the next one. Jack made himself eat something, a can of soup heated on the stove before heading back outside with a flashlight. The night was cold and clear, the kind of Montana night where you could see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. He approached the shed quietly, not wanting to startle the foal. When he peered over the half door, he could see her silhouette in the darkness, still standing in the corner, but with her head lowered now, a slight shift that he hoped meant she was beginning to relax. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. "Just wanted to check on you before bed. I brought you some water." He'd filled an old bucket and now carefully set it inside the door, not too close to her corner, but within reach if she got thirsty during the night. The foal's head came up at the sound of the bucket, her ears swiveling forward for just a second before pinning back again. It was the first time Jack had seen her ears move forward, a tiny sign of interest rather than pure fear, and it sent a small surge of hope through his chest. "I know this is all strange," Jack continued, surprised at how easy it was to talk to her in the darkness where no one else could hear or judge. "I know you don't understand what's happening or why you're here, but I want you to know something." He paused, searching for the right words. "You're safe here. I don't know much about horses, and I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes, but I promise you this, nobody's going to hurt you. Not while I'm around." The foal shifted her weight, and Jack saw her nostrils flare as she tested the air, trying to make sense of this strange human who kept talking to her in that quiet voice. He stayed there for a few more minutes, just breathing, just being present, before finally saying goodnight and heading back to the house. That night, Jack slept better than he had in months. Oh, the nightmares still came. They always did. But when he jerked awake at 3 a.m. with his heart racing and sweat soaking through his shirt, his first thought wasn't of the things he'd seen in Kandahar. Instead, he thought of the foal alone in the shed, probably still frightened, still trying to understand this new reality. He thought about getting up to check on her, but decided against it. She needed rest, and so did he. Morning came too early, pale light filtering through the curtains and birds starting their daily chorus. Jack was up with the first light, his body running on military time even after all these years. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed as he stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the shed. He couldn't see much from this angle, but he found himself straining to catch any sign of movement, any indication that the foal had made it through the night. The rational part of his brain knew she was probably fine, but the part that had learned to expect the worst in every situation kept whispering doubts. He dressed quickly, pulling on worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, then grabbed his jacket and headed outside. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the shed, moving slowly, deliberately, trying to make his footsteps predictable. The research he'd done the night before emphasized routine and consistency, the importance of becoming a non-threatening fixture in the horse's environment. When he looked over the half door, relief flooded through him. The foal was still there, standing now rather than pressed into the corner, and the water bucket had been knocked over, which meant she'd at least investigated it even if she hadn't drunk much. Her coat looked rough in the morning light, the scars standing out starkly against the darker patches of her hide. She watched him with those same wary eyes, but her body language had shifted slightly. She wasn't quite as tense, wasn't trembling the way she had been yesterday. "Good morning," Jack said softly, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm going to come in and get this bucket, okay? Just need to fill it up again." He unlatched the bottom half of the door, moving with exaggerated slowness, giving her time to process each action before he took the next step. The foal's ears flicked back and forth, tracking his movements, and she shifted her weight as if preparing to bolt, but she didn't. Jack kept talking, a running commentary of what he was doing, not because he thought she understood the words, but because the sound of his voice seemed to help both of them stay calm. He retrieved the bucket without incident, though the foal pressed herself back into the corner as he moved through the space. Outside, he filled it with fresh water from the hose, then carried it back and set it in the same spot as before. Consistency, he reminded himself. Predictability helps build trust. He also laid out several flakes of hay near the door, not too close to her, but close enough that she could reach it when she felt brave enough. The hay was from Bill Henderson's barn, part of his payment for borrowing the trailer, and Jack made a mental note to get his own supply as soon as possible. After securing the shed, Jack stood outside for a few minutes, just being present. He'd read about this technique, about how horses were prey animals who needed to learn that a human's presence didn't automatically mean danger. So he stayed there, leaning against the fence post a few feet from the door, not looking directly at the foal, but keeping her in his peripheral vision. He sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and watched the sun climb higher in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The sound of a truck coming up the drive broke the morning stillness. Jack recognized the vehicle before it came into full view. Doc Henderson's old Ford with the veterinary practice logo fading on the door. The old vet had been making house calls in this county for 40 years, and there wasn't much about animals he didn't know. Jack had called him last night, leaving a message about the foal, and Doc had apparently decided to come by first thing. "Jack Morrison," Doc called out as he climbed out of the truck, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Heard you went and bought yourself a project at the auction." The veterinarian was in his 70s, but moved with the energy of a much younger man, grabbing his medical bag from the passenger seat. "Sarah called me last night, worried about you. Said you weren't answering your phone." Jack felt a flicker of annoyance at his sister's interference, but it was hard to stay mad when Doc's eyes were twinkling with something that looked like approval rather than judgment. "Yeah, I might have acted on impulse," Jack admitted, walking over to meet him. "She's in rough shape, Doc, physically and mentally." "Let's take a look," Doc said, and together they approached the shed. The old veterinarian peered over the door, taking in the foal's appearance with a practiced eye. He was quiet for a long moment, and Jack found himself holding his breath, waiting for the verdict. "Well," Doc finally said, "she's definitely been through something. Those scars are from barbed wire. Looks like she was tangled up good before someone got her free. The older ones have healed well, but some of these newer marks need attention." Jack's stomach tightened. "How bad is it? Can she recover?" Doc glanced at him, and Jack saw understanding in those weathered eyes. "Physically? Sure. With proper care, good nutrition, time to heal, she'll be fine. Might always have the scars, but they won't slow her down." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But Jack, you need to understand, This isn't just about physical healing. This foal has learned that humans mean pain and fear. Undoing that kind of trauma takes time, patience, and a gentleness that not everyone has. Jack felt those words settle somewhere deep in his chest. "I know about trauma," he said quietly. Doc nodded, not pressing for details he probably already knew from small-town gossip and Sarah's concerned phone calls. "That's why I think you might be exactly what she needs. Sometimes the broken know how to heal the broken." Over the next hour, Doc talked Jack through everything he'd need to know. The foal was indeed about 8 months old, young enough that she could still learn to trust, but old enough that the fear was deeply embedded. She was underweight, her ribs too visible beneath that rough coat, and she'd need a specialized feeding program to bring her back to health slowly without shocking her system. Doc wrote everything down in his methodical handwriting: proper portions of grain, quality hay, supplements for her coat and hooves, all of it adding up to expenses Jack couldn't really afford. When Doc mentioned costs, Jack must have flinched because the old veterinarian stopped mid-sentence. "Look, I know you're on a fixed income," Doc said gently. "Tell you what, I'll donate my time for her care, at least for the first few months. And I can probably get the feed store to work out some kind of payment plan. Hank owes me a favor anyway after I saved his prize bull last spring." Jack wanted to refuse the charity, his pride bristling at the thought of handouts, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't about him. "I appreciate that, Doc. Really, I'll pay you back when I can." "I know you will," Doc said simply. "Now the immediate concern is getting her comfortable enough to let us check those fresher wounds. I saw a couple that might need cleaning and ointment to prevent infection, but pushing her right now could set back any progress you make. So here's what I suggest." He pulled out a tube of antibiotic ointment and some supplies. "You spend the next few days just being around her. Don't try to touch her. Don't make any demands. Just exist in her space. Bring her food and water. Talk to her. Let her learn that you're not a threat. Once she relaxes even a little, we can try to treat those wounds." Over the next week, Jack fell into a routine that became the framework of his days. Every morning at sunrise, he'd bring fresh water and hay to the shed, moving slowly and deliberately, narrating his actions in that same quiet voice. "I'm just going to set this down. No need to worry. You're safe." The foal would press herself into the corner, watching his every move, but gradually the trembling lessened. Gradually, she stopped trying to make herself smaller when he entered. Jack started spending more time just sitting outside the shed, a folding chair positioned where she could see him through the open top of the door. He'd bring his coffee, sometimes a book he never actually read, and just be there. Sometimes he'd talk to her, rambling stories about his childhood on a farm in Nebraska, about his time in the service before everything went wrong, about the quiet beauty of Montana mornings. Other times he'd sit in silence, both of them existing together in a space that demanded nothing from either of them. On the third day, he noticed she'd eaten most of the hay. On the fourth day, he caught her drinking from the water bucket while he sat in his chair, her eyes on him but no longer showing quite as much white. Small victories, but they felt monumental. Each tiny step forward was proof that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt even after it had been shattered. If she could learn to trust again, maybe he could too. Sarah called every other day, her voice tight with worry that she tried to mask with practicality. "Are you eating? Are you taking your medications? Have you been to your therapy appointments?" Jack answered truthfully, more or less, leaving out the parts where he'd skipped meals because he'd spent his food budget on alfalfa hay, or how he'd missed his last VA appointment because the foal had seemed particularly stressed that day and he hadn't wanted to leave her alone. His sister finally drove out on Saturday morning, pulling up in her sensible sedan with that expression on her face that Jack knew meant she was prepared for an intervention. But when he walked her out to the shed and she saw the foal, something in her face softened. "Oh, Jack," she breathed, taking in the scars, the still wary stance, the obvious signs of trauma. She's so young. Her name's Phoenix, Jack said, the name coming to him in that moment as if it had always been there waiting, rising from the ashes. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "You're different," she said softly. "These past few days you look more alive than I've seen you in 3 years." "She's giving me a reason to get up in the morning," Jack admitted. "Something to focus on besides the things I can't change. Every small bit of progress she makes feels like hope, you know?" Sarah stayed for hours that day, sitting with Jack outside the shed while he maintained his patient vigil. She watched as he talked to Phoenix in that steady, gentle voice, explaining that his sister was there but that she meant no harm. The foal observed them both from her corner, her ears flicking between them, processing this new development in her carefully controlled world. When Sarah left, she hugged Jack tighter than she had in years and pressed a folded check into his hand. "For Phoenix," she said firmly when he tried to refuse. "Consider it an investment in both of your futures." As days turned into weeks, the changes in Phoenix were subtle but undeniable. She no longer pressed herself into the corner when Jack entered the shed. Instead, she'd stand in the middle of the space, watching him with an alertness that spoke more of curiosity than pure terror. Her coat was beginning to show signs of improvement, the dullness giving way to a hint of shine as proper nutrition worked its magic. The sharp angles of her ribs were softening, her body filling out into the sturdy frame of a young horse, finding her strength. Jack started opening the shed door completely during his sitting sessions, giving Phoenix the option to come out into the small attached paddock he'd repaired. For 3 days, she ignored the opening, content to remain in the safety of her enclosed space. But on the 4th day, as Jack sat reading aloud from a book about Wyoming ranching history, he heard the tentative sound of hooves on wood. He kept his eyes on the page, fighting the urge to look up as Phoenix stepped cautiously through the doorway and into the sunlight. She stood there for a long moment, her body tense and ready to bolt back inside at the slightest provocation. Jack kept reading, his voice steady and unhurried, as if her emergence was the most natural thing in the world. Slowly, Phoenix took a few more steps, then a few more, until she was standing in the paddock, the sun warming her back, the grass beneath her hooves. She lowered her head and took a tentative bite of the green growth, then another, and Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion at this simple act of a horse grazing in a field. That evening, Doc Henderson stopped by for one of his increasingly frequent visits. The old veterinarian had taken to dropping in every few days, always with some excuse, needing to check on Phoenix's progress or bringing by some feed supplement he'd gotten a deal on. But Jack suspected Doc just enjoyed witnessing the transformation, both in the horse and in the man caring for her. When Doc saw Phoenix out in the paddock, still nervous but grazing peacefully while Jack sat nearby, he let out a low whistle of approval. "Now that's progress," Doc said quietly, not wanting to startle the foal. "2 weeks ago, I wasn't sure she'd ever trust enough to leave that shed." Jack nodded, unable to take his eyes off Phoenix. "She's stronger than she looks." Doc clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. "So are you, son. So are you." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Jack had brought Phoenix home. He'd just set down her grain bucket and was backing away as usual when Phoenix did something she'd never done before. Instead of waiting for him to leave, she took a step toward the bucket while he was still there, then another step. Jack froze, barely breathing as she stretched her neck out and began to eat, her eyes on him but her body language saying she was willing to take this risk. They stayed like that for several minutes, Jack standing perfectly still while Phoenix ate, the sound of her chewing the only noise in the quiet morning. From that day forward, progress accelerated. Phoenix began following Jack with her eyes whenever he was in sight, sometimes even nickering softly when he approached the paddock. The sound, the first vocalization she'd made beyond snorts of fear, nearly brought Jack to his knees. She was reaching out, trying to communicate, building a bridge across the chasm of her trauma. He started spending hours in the paddock with her, sometimes just sitting on the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening, letting her approach him on her own terms. The first time Phoenix touched him was accident, or at least Jack told himself it was. She'd been grazing near where he sat, gradually working closer over the course of an hour, when she misjudged the distance and her muzzle brushed his shoulder. She jerked back immediately, snorting in alarm, and Jack's heart hammered in his chest. But he didn't move, didn't react beyond a quiet, "It's okay, girl, just me." After a moment, Phoenix took a tentative step closer, then another, until she was standing right beside him, her nose inches from his face. She breathed in his scent, studying him with those deep brown eyes, and Jack felt tears tracking down his cheeks. "Hey, Phoenix," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I see you, girl. I see how brave you are." She huffed softly, her warm breath washing over his face, and in that moment Jack understood something profound. They were healing each other. Every day that he showed up for her, patient and consistent and gentle, he was showing himself that he was capable of those same things. Every time she chose to trust him a little more, she was teaching him that trust was possible, that connection could exist without pain, that being vulnerable didn't have to mean being destroyed. His nightmares were still there, they might always be there, but they came less frequently now. The Montana winter arrived early that year, bringing with it snow that blanketed the property in white silence. Jack had spent the autumn months preparing, insulating the shed, stockpiling hay and feed, making sure Phoenix would be comfortable through the cold months ahead. She was no longer the terrified, skeletal foal he'd brought home. At 10 months old now, she was growing into her frame, her coat thick and glossy, her movements more confident. The scars were still there, pale lines across her dark hide, but they'd become part of her story rather than the whole of it. Jack had started basic groundwork with her, teaching her to lead with a rope, to move away from pressure, to trust his guidance. It was slow work, requiring patience he hadn't known he possessed before Phoenix came into his life. Some days were steps forward, Phoenix responding to his cues with an eagerness that made his heart soar. Other days were steps back, something triggering her old fears and sending her skittering away from him, eyes rolling white with remembered terror. On those days, Jack would simply back off, giving her space, starting over from where they'd been before. One particularly difficult morning, after Phoenix had spooked at the sound of a truck backfiring on the distant road and wouldn't let Jack within 10 feet of her, he sat in the snow outside the paddock and called his therapist at the VA. He'd been avoiding appointments, convincing himself he didn't need them anymore, but watching Phoenix struggle with her trauma reminded him that healing wasn't linear. It came in waves, in cycles, in patterns that repeated until you learned to ride them out. Doctor. Martinez listened as Jack talked about Phoenix, about how sometimes she'd be fine and then something small would send her spiraling back into fear. The therapist was quiet for a moment after Jack finished, then said something that struck him deeply. "Sounds like you're describing your own journey too, Jack. The work you're doing with Phoenix, the patience you're showing her. Have you considered showing yourself that same compassion?" That conversation marked a turning point. Jack started attending his therapy sessions again, started taking his medications consistently, started treating his own healing with the same dedication he'd been giving to Phoenix's. He joined a veterans support group that met weekly in town, something he'd resisted for years. The first meeting was awkward, sitting in a circle with 11 other vets, all of them carrying invisible wounds that manifested in different ways. But when it was Jack's turn to share, he found himself talking about Phoenix, about how caring for a traumatized animal had helped him understand his own trauma in new ways. The group listened intently, and afterward, several of them came up to him. An older vet named Frank, who'd served in Vietnam, gripped Jack's shoulder. "Sometimes we need to save something else before we can save ourselves," he said. Jack nodded, recognizing the truth in those words. Another vet, a young woman named Maria, who'd done 3 tours in Iraq, asked if she could come see Phoenix sometime. "I miss being around horses," she admitted. "Used to ride when I was a kid." Jack found himself saying yes, surprising himself with how willing he was to share this part of his life. Maria started visiting on weekends, helping with barn chores and just sitting quietly in the paddock while Phoenix grazed. She never pushed to touch the horse, seemed to understand instinctively that Phoenix needed to make those choices herself. On her 3rd visit, as they sat watching Phoenix play in the snow, bucking and running with the pure joy of a young horse feeling good, Maria said quietly, "She's beautiful, Jack. You saved her life." Jack shook his head. "We saved each other." As winter deepened, Jack started thinking about Phoenix's future. She was young still, would be a yearling come spring, but she was showing signs of intelligence and athleticism that shouldn't go to waste. Doc Henderson had mentioned more than once that Phoenix had good confirmation, that with proper training she could be something special. But what? She'd never be a rodeo horse. The crowds and chaos would terrify her. She couldn't be a ranch horse, not with her fear issues around sudden movements and unexpected situations. It was Bill Henderson, Doc's nephew, who ran a small horse training facility an hour away, who suggested an unexpected option. He'd stopped by one afternoon to drop off some tack Doc had borrowed, and Phoenix had done something remarkable. She'd walked right up to the fence where Bill stood, investigating him with that careful curiosity she'd developed, and Bill had been enchanted. "She's got heart," he told Jack. "I work with a lot of horses, and the ones who've overcome something, they've got this quality that can't be taught. Have you ever thought about endurance riding?" Jack had to admit he'd never heard of it. Bill explained it was a discipline that tested a horse's stamina and a rider's horsemanship over long distances, sometimes 50 or even 100 miles in a single day. "It's not about speed," Bill said. "It's about partnership, about knowing your horse so well you can read every signal, about building trust over miles and miles of trail. The best endurance horses are the ones who want to work with their riders, who see it as a partnership rather than domination." Jack looked at Phoenix, who was watching them with alert interest, and felt something click into place. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and warming temperatures that transformed the Montana landscape. Phoenix, now officially a yearling, seemed to bloom along with the season. Her winter coat shed out to reveal a deep, rich bay underneath, almost black except for the reddish tints that caught the sunlight. She'd grown taller, stronger, her body filling out with muscle from the hours she spent running and playing in the expanded paddock Jack had built over the winter. But it was her spirit that had undergone the most remarkable transformation. The terrified, broken foal was gone, replaced by a confident young horse who greeted Jack each morning with a nicker and an eagerness to see what the day would bring. Bill Henderson had become a regular presence at the property, stopping by twice a week to help Jack learn the basics of horse training. They started slowly, respecting Phoenix's past trauma, building on the foundation of trust Jack had spent months establishing. Bill taught Jack about body language, about reading the subtle signals Phoenix gave, about responding to her communication rather than imposing his will. "This isn't about breaking a horse," Bill explained. "It's about building a conversation where both of you get heard." The first time Jack sat on Phoenix's back was a moment neither of them would forget. They'd spent weeks preparing, getting her used to weight across her body, to the feel of a saddle, to accepting pressure without panic. When the day finally came, Jack's hands were shaking as he eased himself up. Phoenix stood rock still, every muscle tense, and for a long moment Jack thought she might explode. But then she let out a long breath, and Jack felt her relax beneath him. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Such a good, brave girl." They walked for maybe 5 minutes that first day just around the paddock, but it felt like flying. Jack could feel Phoenix's power beneath him, the way her muscles bunched and released with each step, the intelligence in how she picked her way across the uneven ground. When he dismounted, his legs were shaking and tears were streaming down his face. Phoenix turned her head to look at him, and Jack could have sworn he saw pride in her eyes, a recognition that they'd accomplished something important together. Training intensified as spring gave way to summer. Bill mapped out a conditioning program that would build Phoenix's stamina gradually, starting with short rides and slowly increasing the distance. Jack found himself rising before dawn to ride in the cool morning hours, Phoenix's hooves thudding rhythmically on the dirt roads that wound through the countryside. During those rides, with nothing but the sound of Phoenix's breathing and the distant calls of meadowlarks, Jack felt a peace he'd never experienced before. The chaos in his head quieted. The constant vigilance that had defined his existence since Afghanistan softened into simple awareness of the present moment. Other veterans from the support group started coming around, drawn by Maria's stories of how Phoenix had helped Jack heal. Doc Henderson, seeing an opportunity, suggested they formalize it. "What if we started a program?" he proposed one evening as they all gathered around Jack's fire pit. Veterans working with rescued horses. There's research showing how powerful animal therapy can be for PTSD. Jack was hesitant at first, worried about opening his sanctuary to too many people, but Phoenix surprised him. She seemed to sense something in the other vets, an understanding of trauma that created an instant connection. She'd walk up to them with a gentleness she reserved for those who carried invisible wounds, as if she could smell the pain on them. By midsummer, 3 more rescued horses had joined Phoenix on Jack's expanding property, funded by grants Doc had helped secure and donations from the community. Frank was working with a former racehorse who'd been headed for slaughter. Maria had bonded with a gray mare who'd been seized from a neglect case, and a young vet named Chris was learning to trust again through caring for a gelding who'd been abused by his previous owner. Jack watched them all with a sense of wonder, seeing his own journey reflected in theirs, understanding that Phoenix had opened a door he'd never known existed, but Jack's focus remained on Phoenix and their growing partnership. Bill had entered them in their first endurance ride, a 25-mile competition scheduled for late August. It wasn't about winning, Bill emphasized. It was about completion, about proving to themselves that they could do it, about celebrating how far they'd both come. Jack threw himself into preparation, studying maps, learning about vet checks and pacing strategies, conditioning Phoenix until she was fit and eager. The night before the competition, Jack couldn't sleep. He kept walking out to the barn, checking on Phoenix, who seemed amused by his anxiety. She stood calmly in her stall, unconcerned about the trailer already hitched to Jack's truck, the gear packed and ready to go. Jack leaned against her shoulder, breathing in her familiar scent of hay and horse, and whispered all his fears into her mane. "What if I let you down? What if we can't finish? What if all this has been for nothing?" Phoenix turned her head and rested her muzzle against his chest, and in that gesture, Jack found his answer. It wasn't about winning or losing, finishing or failing. It was about showing up, about trying, about facing fears together. They'd already won by being here, by becoming who they were now instead of who they'd been 8 months ago, when a broken veteran had seen a broken foal and recognized a kindred spirit. The competition grounds buzzed with activity when Jack and Phoenix arrived at dawn. Dozens of horse trailers lined the field, riders in colorful gear preparing their mounts, volunteers setting up vet check stations. The noise and chaos made Jack's chest tighten with old anxiety, and he felt Phoenix shift nervously in the trailer, picking up on his tension. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the techniques Dr. Martinez had taught him. Ground yourself. Focus on what you can control. You've got this. Unloading Phoenix took longer than it should have. She backed out of the trailer slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar scene. Other horses called out, their voices sharp and excited, and Phoenix pressed close to Jack's side, seeking reassurance. "Easy, girl," he murmured, stroking her neck. "I know it's a lot. We'll take it one step at a time." They stood by the trailer for several minutes, just breathing together, letting Phoenix observe from a safe distance before Jack began the check-in process. The pre-ride veterinary examination was Phoenix's first real test. A stranger in an official vest approached with a stethoscope, and Jack felt Phoenix's body tense beneath his hand. He positioned himself at her shoulder, maintaining that physical connection that told her she wasn't alone. The vet, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Chen, seemed to understand. She moved slowly, telegraphing every action, giving Phoenix time to accept each part of the exam. When Dr. Chen listened to Phoenix's heart and pronounced it strong and steady, she looked at Jack with approval. "She's in excellent condition. Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it." Bill had arrived earlier and found them after the vet check. He looked at Jack's pale face and tense shoulders and seemed to understand without being told. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You two have already accomplished something remarkable. If you decide right now that this is too much, that you want to load up and go home, there's no shame in that. But if you're going to ride, then ride. Trust yourself and trust Phoenix. You've earned that trust over 8 months of showing up every single day." The starting line was controlled chaos. 75 riders milled about, some on prancing, excited horses, others on calm veterans who'd done this 100 times. Jack found a spot on the edge, giving Phoenix space from the crowd. When the ride director called for attention, explaining the route and safety protocols, Jack forced himself to listen, to focus, to be present. Phoenix stood quietly beside him now, her earlier nervousness settling into alert readiness. She could feel his determination, the shift in his energy from anxious to purposeful. The start was a rolling one, riders leaving in small groups to prevent crowding on the trail. Jack and Phoenix went out in the middle pack, falling into an easy trot that ate up ground without wasting energy. The first few miles were about finding their rhythm, about remembering everything Bill had taught them about pacing. Jack monitored Phoenix's breathing, her stride, the way she carried herself. She moved beneath him with confidence, her ears pricked forward, taking in the new experience with curiosity rather than fear. They climbed into the foothills as the sun rose higher, the trail winding through pine forests and across open meadows. Other riders passed them, some calling out friendly encouragement. A few asked about Phoenix, commenting on her unusual scars, and Jack found himself telling her story in brief exchanges. Each time he spoke about how far she'd come, he felt his own chest expand with pride. Around mile 10, they reached the first vet check, a mandatory stop where horses were examined to ensure they were fit to continue. Dr. Chen was stationed there, and she smiled when she saw them approach. Phoenix's vital signs were perfect, her recovery time excellent. "You've got an athlete here," Dr. Chen told Jack as she cleared them to continue. "And you're riding smart. Keep it up." The second half of the ride tested them in ways Jack hadn't anticipated. The temperature climbed, making hydration critical. Phoenix had to cross her first creek, something she'd never encountered before, and she balked at the water's edge. Jack felt the old fear rising in her, that freeze response that came from trauma. He could have pushed her, forced her through, but that wasn't their way. Instead, he dismounted and led her to the water, letting her smell it, see it, understand it wasn't a threat. He stepped in first, the cold water soaking his boots, showing her it was safe. Phoenix watched him for a long moment, then carefully placed one hoof in the creek, then another. They crossed together, Jack walking beside her, and when they reached the other side, he felt like they'd conquered mountains. Around mile 20, Jack's body started protesting. His bad leg throbbed, his back ached, and exhaustion pulled at him like weights. Phoenix felt it, He could tell by the way she adjusted her gait, trying to make it easier for him. In that moment, Jack understood the depth of their partnership. She was taking care of him just as he'd taken care of her. The final 5 miles were a blur of determination and grit. Jack's vision narrowed to the trail ahead, to Phoenix's steady rhythm, to the simple act of continuing forward. When they finally crossed the finish line, the crowd's cheers seemed to come from very far away. Jack dismounted on shaking legs, his whole body trembling from exhaustion and emotion. Phoenix stood beside him, breathing hard but steady, her coat dark with honest sweat. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. Bill was there immediately, taking Phoenix's reins while Jack bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. When he looked up, he saw Sarah pushing through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Behind her were Maria, Frank, Chris, and half a dozen other vets from the support group, all of them cheering like Jack and Phoenix had just won the Kentucky Derby. The post-ride vet check was the final hurdle. Dr. Chen examined Phoenix thoroughly, checking her heart rate recovery, her muscle tone, her hydration levels. Phoenix stood quietly through it all, almost seeming to understand the importance of this final evaluation. When Dr. Chen looked up and smiled, Jack felt his knees go weak with relief. "She's passed with flying colors. Congratulations, you two make quite a team." The veterinarian paused, studying the scars that still marked Phoenix's body. "I saw her paperwork, saw she came from the auction. What you've done with her is nothing short of remarkable." As the afternoon wore on and the final riders trickled in, Jack learned they'd placed 32nd out of 75 entries. Middle of the pack, nothing flashy, but they'd completed every mile with good scores at every vet check. Bill clapped him on the back, grinning. For a first ride, on a yearling who 8 months ago was considered unadoptable. That's champion-level work, Jack. That's the kind of partnership most riders spend years trying to build. The award ceremony happened at sunset, golden light painting the mountains in shades of amber and purple. Jack almost didn't go, content to care for Phoenix and head home, but Sarah insisted. "They need to see you both," she said firmly. "They need to see what's possible." So Jack led Phoenix up to the gathering, her hooves clopping softly on the grass, and found himself surrounded by people wanting to hear their story. "How did you rehabilitate her? What's your training philosophy? Would you consider giving clinics for other rescued horses?" When the ride director took the microphone to hand out awards, she started with the winners, those who'd completed the course in record times on experienced horses worth tens of thousands of dollars. Jack clapped politely, happy for them but ready to leave. Then the director said something that made him freeze. "Before we finish tonight, I want to recognize a special partnership." She looked directly at Jack and Phoenix. 8 months ago, Jack Morrison bought a wild Mustang foal at auction for $2. She was scarred, traumatized, and considered by most to be beyond help. Today, that same foal completed her first endurance ride with scores that would make any experienced horse proud. The crowd turned to look at them, and Jack felt his face flush. But the director wasn't finished. This sport isn't just about speed or winning. It's about the bond between horse and rider, about trust and partnership and the willingness to keep going even when it's hard. What Jack and Phoenix represent is the heart of endurance riding. She held up a special ribbon, deep purple with gold lettering. "This is our Courage Award given to the team that exemplifies the spirit of perseverance. I can't think of anyone more deserving." As Jack accepted the ribbon, his hands shaking, he heard someone in the crowd say, "That's the vet, right? The one who started that program for other vets and rescued horses?" Someone else responded, "Yeah, he's helped a lot of people. Saved a lot of animals too." Jack felt Phoenix's nose bump against his shoulder, her familiar gesture of connection, and suddenly the crowd and the noise and the attention didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, this recognition not of victory, but of survival. of choosing to heal, of refusing to give up on each other. That night, back at home with Phoenix settled in her stall with extra hay and a warm mash, Jack sat on his porch and called Dr. Martinez. He needed to tell someone who would understand the full significance of what had happened. A year ago, he told her, I couldn't get out of bed most days. I couldn't see a future. I'd given up on myself. There was a long pause before Dr. Martinez responded, her voice thick with emotion. And now? Now I have a reason to get up every morning. I have other people depending on me. I have Phoenix. Jack looked toward the barn where he could see Phoenix's dark silhouette in her stall. She saved my life, you know, not just by giving me purpose, but by showing me that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. Over the following months, Jack and Phoenix competed in more endurance rides, each one building their partnership and proving that with patience and trust, anything was possible. The veteran horse program grew, helping dozens of former soldiers find healing through caring for rescued animals. Jack became a voice in the community for both veterans' rights and animal welfare, his story inspiring others to see the connections between different kinds of trauma and healing. But his favorite moments were still the quiet ones, early morning rides when it was just him and Phoenix, the Montana landscape spreading out before them like a promise. The purple ribbon hung in the barn, fading slightly with time but never losing its significance. Sometimes Jack would look at it and remember that day at the auction, when he'd spent $2 on a wild foal everyone else had given up on. Best investment I ever made, he'd tell visitors who asked about it. She didn't just become a champion. She made me one too. Not because we won races or collected trophies, but because we chose to face our scars together and prove that broken things can heal, that trust can be rebuilt, and that sometimes the greatest victories are simply surviving and learning to hope again.